Okay, so I need to tell you about something that's been eating at me for days now. And it's not what you think. You've probably seen the headlines. Trump lashing out at Canada again. More tariff threats, more insults. But here's what nobody's talking about. Why is he so fixated on Mark Carney specifically? Not Trudeau, not some policy disagreement. Mark Carney. And the answer? It's going to tell you more about Donald Trump's actual fears than anything he's ever said out loud. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you changes everything. Let me start with a moment that didn't get enough attention. 3 weeks ago, Mark Carney gave a speech, measured, boring even, about trade policy and economic stability. The kind of speech that normally puts people to sleep. Trump's response? Volcanic. Not just angry, threatened. And that word matters. Because here's the thing about Donald Trump that we've learned over the years. He doesn't lash out randomly. There's always a tell, always a psychological trigger. And Mark Carney just walked right into the one trigger Trump can't control. But before I tell you what that trigger is, you need to understand who Mark Carney actually is. Because this is where it gets interesting. Carney isn't a politician who stumbled into economics. He's not some regional leader playing on the world stage. This is a guy who ran the Bank of Canada, then ran the Bank of England, and is now being talked about as Canada's next prime minister. Goldman Sachs trained, Oxford educated, the kind of resume that in any other context, Trump would want to brag about having at Mar-a-Lago. But here's what makes Carney different, and this is the part that should make your ears perk up. Everywhere he's gone, he's been called the same thing. The adult in the room, the steady hand, the guy who doesn't panic when markets panic. And that is Donald Trump's worst nightmare. Let me show you why. Trump's entire brand, his whole political identity, is built on one core premise: that chaos is strength, that disruption equals power, that the loudest voice in the room is the most important voice. For 30 years, that's worked for him. In real estate, in reality TV, in politics, being the center of attention has been his competitive advantage. Mark Carney represents the complete opposite philosophy, and he's winning with it. Think about what that means for Trump psychologically. Here's a guy who's quieter, more boring, deliberately uncharismatic. And Americans are looking at him with something Trump hasn't seen directed at a foreign leader in years. Respect. Not fear, not attention, respect. You know what's even worse for Trump? Carney isn't trying to compete with him. He's not playing Trump's game at all. He's playing a completely different game. And that game is working. Let me give you a concrete example of what I mean. When Trump threatened Canada with tariffs, Carney didn't fire back on Twitter. He didn't hold a press conference to call Trump names. He didn't play the game. Instead, he quietly started building trade relationships with Europe, with Asia, with anyone who wanted a predictable partner. And then, here's the kicker. American conservatives started praising him for it. Can you imagine what that does to Trump's brain? The people who are supposed to be his base, looking at a foreign leader and saying, why can't our guy be more like that? That's not a political problem for Trump. That's an identity crisis. Now here's where this gets really psychological, and I want you to follow me on this because it explains so much. Trump's power has always come from controlling the emotional temperature of the room. He escalates, you respond, he escalates more, and suddenly everyone's operating at his frequency. That's how he's dominated Republican politics for a decade. That's how he's controlled media cycles. He sets the emotional tone, and everyone else reacts to it. Carney refuses to react, and that refusal is more threatening to Trump than any insult could ever be. Because here's what Trump actually fears more than anything: irrelevance. Not losing, relevance. He can spin losing. He's been spinning losses his whole life. But being ignored? Being treated as if your tantrum doesn't matter? That's the one thing he can't spin. And that's exactly what Carney is doing. Not ignoring Trump out of disrespect, but treating him the way you treat a problem to be managed rather than an enemy to be fought. It's clinical, it's cold, and it's working. Let me show you the pattern, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every time Trump attacks Canada, Carney's response is some version of, "We remain committed to our partnership with the United States." Boring, right? But watch what happens next. While Trump is still raging on social media, Carney is on the phone with European leaders, Asian trade ministers, building exactly the kind of stable, predictable partnerships that Trump's chaos makes impossible. In other words, Carney is using Trump's volatility as a competitive advantage. And Trump knows it. That's why he's so angry. But there's another layer to this, and it's the layer that I think really gets under Trump's skin. Mark Carney is everything Trump pretends to be. Think about it. Trump sells himself as the successful businessman, the deal maker, the guy who knows economics. But Carney actually is those things. He actually ran central banks. He actually stabilized economies during crises. He actually has the credentials Trump wishes he had. And he's doing it all without the performance, without the gold toilets, without the spectacle, just competence. Quiet, boring, effective competence. That contrast is devastating for Trump's brand, because it exposes something Trump has spent his entire life trying to hide. That real power doesn't need to announce itself. You want to know how I know this is what's really happening? Look at who else Trump attacks this way. Not strong opponents, not people who are beating him. He attacks people who make him feel inadequate, people who have something he wants but can't buy or bully his way into having. Respect, legitimacy, actual competence. Mark Carney has all three, and he's not even trying. That's the part that probably drives Trump the craziest. Carney isn't competing for attention. He's just doing the job. And somehow that's more threatening than any competitor Trump's ever faced. Now let me connect this to something bigger, because this isn't just about two guys and their egos. What we're actually watching is a clash between two completely different models of leadership. And the terrifying part for Trump is that Americans are starting to prefer the model he doesn't represent. For years, Trump convinced a lot of people that strong leadership looks like dominance. Loud, aggressive, unpredictable, always on offense. That worked when people were angry and wanted disruption. But here's what's changing. People are exhausted. They're tired of the chaos. They're tired of waking up wondering what crisis is going to blow up their day. They're tired of leaders who treat every disagreement like a personal war. And when they look at Mark Carney, they see an alternative they didn't know they were missing. Calm authority, measured responses, someone who absorbs pressure instead of amplifying it. That's not weakness to them anymore. That's strength. And that realization is spreading. You can see it in the way conservatives talk about Carney. They're not praising his policies necessarily. They're praising his temperament, his steadiness, the fact that he doesn't make everything about himself. And every time someone says that out loud, it's an implicit criticism of Trump. Why can't our leader be like that? The question doesn't even need to be asked directly. It's hanging in the air. This is where Trump's fear becomes visible, because he built his entire political career on the idea that his way was the only way, that strength equals volatility, that leadership equals spectacle. Mark Carney's existence, his success, his growing respect among American conservatives, it disproves that theory. And if that theory is wrong, what does Trump have left? Here's the really fascinating part psychologically. Trump can't attack Carney the way he attacks other opponents. He can't call him low energy because Carney's whole brand is measured energy. He can't call him stupid because Carney's credentials are bulletproof. He can't call him corrupt because there's nothing there. So what does Trump do? He attacks the fact that Americans are listening to him. He attacks the fact that Carney dared to speak to American audiences. Because that's the tell. That's Trump revealing what he's actually afraid of. That Americans might prefer what they're hearing. The panic isn't about trade policy. It's about validation. Trump needs Americans to validate his model of leadership. And every time someone looks at Mark Carney and thinks, that's what leadership should look like, Trump loses a piece of that validation. Now here's where this gets uncomfortable for Trump, and why I think this particular fight is different from all his other fights. Usually, when Trump attacks someone, there's a calculation. He thinks he can win. He thinks he can dominate the news cycle, control the narrative, make his opponent look weak. But with Carney, there's no win condition. If Trump escalates, Carney doesn't escalate back, which makes Trump look unhinged. If Trump backs down, he looks weak. If Trump ignores Carney, Carney keeps doing exactly what he's doing, building partnerships, earning respect, making Trump's chaos look like an obstacle to manage rather than a force to fear. Trump's caught in a trap of his own making, and the more he struggles, the more he proves Carney's point. This is what I mean when I say this is about fear. Real, visceral fear. Not fear of losing an election or a trade deal. Fear of becoming irrelevant. Fear that the world is moving on. Fear that his model of leadership is being replaced by something he can't compete with. And you know what the saddest part is? Trump's right to be afraid, because what we're watching in real time is a shift in what Americans consider legitimate leadership. The spectacle is losing its power. The chaos is losing its appeal. People are looking for something different, something steadier, something that doesn't exhaust them. Mark Carney didn't set out to become a threat to Donald Trump. He just kept doing what he's always done, being competent, measured, and effective. But in doing that, in refusing to play Trump's game, he became the one thing Trump can't handle, a mirror, showing Americans what they've been missing, showing them that leadership doesn't have to be a performance, that strength doesn't have to be loud, that power doesn't have to be chaos. And once people see that mirror, once they recognize what's been missing, Trump's whole brand starts to crack. That's why he's so fixated on Carney. Not because of trade policy, not because of economic disagreements, but because Mark Carney represents an existential threat to everything Trump has built his identity on. The quiet guy is winning, and Trump knows it. So the next time you see Trump rage tweeting about Canada or Mark Carney or some perceived slight, don't just see it as another tantrum. See it for what it really is. Fear. Fear that Americans are starting to ask the question Trump never wanted them to ask. What if strength doesn't look like chaos? What if leadership doesn't require spectacle? What if competence is actually more powerful than performance? Mark Carney isn't trying to answer those questions. He's just living them. And that might be the most threatening thing anyone's done to Donald Trump in his entire political career. Because you can't bully someone who won't play your game. You can't dominate someone who won't fight on your terms. And you can't perform your way out of being exposed. All you can do is rage. and hope nobody notices that the rage itself is the admission. Stay with me, because this story is far from over. And what happens next? It's going to tell us everything about where American leadership is actually heading.